Welcome everybody to the Licensing Committee. Can I remind everyone to use their microphones when they're speaking because we're on the webcast. Thank you. Item number 1, appointment of our Vice Chair. Do we have any nominations for the appointment?
I'd like to nominate Councillor Simon Marlow, please.
Thank you, Kat. And do we have a seconder? Thank you.
I'd be delighted to second it.
Thank you. Are there any other nominations? Okay, so please can we have a show of hands, all those in favour? And any against? And any abstentions? It's carried. Thank you, Councillor Marlow. Do we have any apologies for absence?
No apologies, Chair.
So item 3, the minutes of the Licensing Committee from 23rd of October 23. We need to just check that you're happy that they are correct and that I can sign them. Do we have a proposer for that, please? Councillor Dunlop, thank you. And a seconder? Thank you, Councillor. All those in favour? Anybody against? Any abstentions? 1 abstention, thank you. That's carried. So there's been a slight change of process to the licensing subcommittee minutes. Some of you will be aware that when we were trying to approve them in subsequent meetings, we might not have had the same committee members. So we were concerned that we weren't signing them appropriately. So they're now arriving at this committee. We do have listed those members who were at those subcommittees, and we believe we can get through approving those at this meeting. So this is the first attempt at that. So item 4 is giving us the licensing subcommittee minutes for the 28th of November 23. Present at that one is myself, Councillor Defthley and Councillor Marlow. So that means that I'm able to propose that those minutes are correct of that day, and if somebody could please second that. And then can we vote that they're correct in favour? Anybody against? And no abstentions. Thank you. So this, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, is that an abstention? Yes, thank you. Yeah. Should it just be the 3 who vote, or everybody?
Yeah, it should be 3.
Just the 3 who vote. That's part to it. Sorry, it's a new process. And so the same again for item 5, minutes of the licensing subcommittee, 8th of April 24. The team that time was myself, Councillor Townsend and Councillor Smith. So again, I can propose those minutes as a true representation. Could I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Smith, and all those in favour? Anybody against? And no abstentions. Okay, thank you. Okay, Chairman's announcements. We've gone through those minutes. So we've been quite quiet as a committee for some months, but there's been quite a lot of activity going on behind the scenes. You will have been aware that 2 decisions were made by the Head of Housing and Health. The first one was an amendment to the East Herts Council pavement licence policy and associated fees. So the decision was to approve amendments to the existing East Herts Council pavement licence policy in line with amendments to the Business and Planning Act 2020, including amending fees to £500 from a first-time licence and £350 for a renewal of an existing licence. And the second decision was amendment to the legislative basis for East Herts Council licensing and regulation of markets. So that was to amend the legislative basis for East Herts Council's licensing and regulation of markets from use of powers under street trading provisions in the Local Government Miscellaneous Provisions Act 1982 to those afforded the council under the Food Act 1984. And our officer Oliver Rawlings has agreed to just give us a quick briefing on those.
I'll just try and flesh those out a little bit. So pavement licensing is tables and chairs on the public highway, generally by restaurants and pubs. They're there for consumption of food and drink. They can't be just for drink. So the original regime was operated by highways. That's been operating for a number of years. And then during the pandemic, a temporary regime, a fast track regime was introduced that we administered. One of the downsides of that was that we didn't have the enforcement powers. So we would go out and go, would you like a very cheap license to do something? A few people would, the people next door wouldn't. There'd be no enforcement. So then pretty much everyone stopped applying because however cheap it was, there was no consequence to not applying. As of the 31st of March this year, the Business and Planning Act changed so that it's a permanent regime for pavement licensing with us and stopped the regime that highways do for pavement licensing. So we now have enforcement powers coming from it, so that the change in the policy was away from a week's consultation and a week to make a decision to the 2 weeks consultation and 2 weeks to make a decision now, and to change the enforcement powers that we have. So we realise across the district there are lots of premises that during the pandemic have benefited from tables and chairs outside. There hasn't been any enforcement, so there has been, to a certain extent, carte blanche to put tables and chairs wherever you want. Within our policy, there's obviously accessibility rules, and we monitor the type of furniture, the times things go out. You can't leave them out on the highway overnight. They have to be removed. Lots of different rules. But we understand we're not going to go out and start enforcing this straight away because our powers allow us to take people's tables and chairs away, and then they only get them back once they've paid for the storage. If after 3 months they haven't paid, we can sell their furniture. So we're not intending to leap straight from no enforcement and someone may have had tables and chairs out for 5 years to suddenly driving up in a van, giving them a notice and taking their furniture away. So we are going to be contacting all of the businesses that we're aware of that have tables and chairs outside and advising them to contact us, and then we can advise them on the route for applying and whether they want to or not. Some places are obviously not going to get granted licenses because they may be on a pavement of a width that it means people have to walk in the road to get past their tables and chairs. So they will, essentially the conversation we have with them will be different because they can apply if they want, but it's going to get refused because it doesn't meet the policy. So then we have to move down the route of either they remove them or we have to look at enforcement action. I think that covers pavement licensing unless I've missed anything. So it's going to be a big piece of work for us because no one's ever really approached them all. So if you walk through Hertford, you see there's maybe 3 or 4 that have actually got licenses in Hertford, all the others haven't. And then across the district, there's very few.
Raise one question. Does that encompass as well mobile hoardings and A-frames?
So A boards is excluded. So we won't be controlling those. That'll still stay with highways. There's a limitation on what you can put in. We've created a new web page that clearly says what types of furniture is allowed and what's not allowed. So there's lots of bits. So you can't have cooking equipment out there. That's not a pavement license for and things like that. So we approve the furniture. We approve the barriers that are used. There's items like having weighted menus so they're not blowing around the street, serviette dispensers so they're not blowing around the street, and items like that. So it's a case by case basis, but the policy is a guide for what you can and can't put out. So it would depend on what sort of hoarding you're talking about as to whether it would be allowed or not.
Thank you very much for that. But one slight supplementary question on that as well is it's not just for licensed premises, it's for cafes and restaurants, but also those that come under licensed premises, then it's for food and drink, but not just drink. Right.
So it is, the regime is there. You'll see in Hertford there are a few clothes shops and hairdressers that have tables and chairs outside, I guess just for people for waiting or somewhere for the staff to sit. That's all encompassed within this act. Anything that's on the highway, if you're on private land, you're fine. If it's on the public highway, there's the license fee is cost recovery. So there isn't 2 tables and chairs is £100, 20 tables and chairs is £500. The first application is £500 regardless of how little furniture you have. because the same amount of work goes into issuing a license for 2 tables and chairs as it does for 20.
Thank you, Chair. Presumably, well, sorry, I say presumably, are you going to communicate this to businesses throughout East Herts, or what's the plan? Because obviously you've already alluded to the fact that people are doing it, and many probably won't even realise they should be applying for the licence. Thank you.
So we've been building a list of who we know definitely does do it, but we are going to be going out. Everyone will get a letter, a hand delivered letter and a visit. So there's someone to talk to at that time if they go, oh, what's it? So they don't just put it away. So everyone will get visited. It's quite a big piece of work for us. And then if everyone applies, it generates some income, but it's also a new huge piece of work for us as well. So we're taking, as I said, sort of the softly approach, but everyone will get a letter explaining the regime, explaining what they should do, and asking them to contact the team.
So Smith.
Sorry, do you have a time frame, a vague time frame of sort of that initial stage when people will be contacted?
The vague time frame I would estimate at 2 months at the moment, because we're relatively short on the ground. So we've got a list of the premises that are the highest risk as well. So they have tables and chairs in positions that are inappropriate. So they'll be they'll be visited first to have a discussion with them because they're unsafe and they're a risk to the public. And then we'll work our way through from there. So it depends how much work that generates as to whether that 2-month timeline pushes back.
May I raise one other point as well? With regard to those, how does it fit around the health and safety risk to partially sighted and blind people? Because that is an ongoing problem, an increasing problem, especially with A-frames, etc. And I know several local residents within Bishop Stortford who have had some very nasty injuries because they've careered into one of these unwittingly and then gone head forward onto the pavement or onto the thing they've tripped over as well.
So it is all linked to that. So licenses to be refused in places where it would be dangerous. There's certain widths that need to be maintained of pavement so that it's accessible for people in wheelchairs or mobility scooters. We've had a number of complaints about various premises not leaving enough room on the pavement, and those are the ones we're going to first. So part of the regime is that we approve the barriers, and they should be barriers that partially sighted people or blind people are more likely to come across without falling over, rather than just a table and chair put down. There should be barriered off areas.
Thank you very much.
If I move briefly onto markets. So the move to the Food Act allows the authority to have a much more flexible approach to markets. So we're currently doing it under street trading, and it was never designed for markets. So it's sort of been shoehorned into a certain extent. So we have no leeway with fees. We have no leeway with periods of consultation. So we've done our best to make it flexible and get people onto the markets. But under the Food Act, we can have a new policy that allows so occasional markets, which street trading doesn't allow. So if you had somebody wanted to come in with a specialist market with 20 stalls, each of those stalls would need a street trading license at a significant cost. But under the Food Act, we can have a policy that says we do markets of this size at this cost, one application, and they come in. So we're just trying to make it much easier for traders to get on. Like I said, it gives us more flexibility in the fees and everything we do. So the policy will be much more inclusive and will hopefully drive footfall and traders into our markets.
Does that include, therefore, inaccessible areas that are safely cordoned off from general public, such as street food vendors, when they have got cooking facility out in the open?
So that would be case by case. So generally that would be street trading. So if an area's, even if it's cordoned off, if it's accessible by the public, so like a pub car park or a field, then that's technically street trading, because any member of the public can walk on and purchase without having any other sort of preclusion. So for example, food traders at a car boot sale where someone has to pay £1 to get in, it's not free to the public to get in, it's not street trading. If you're in that same field and you weren't charging £1 to get into the field, It's technically street trading. So it's case by case. I couldn't answer your question directly without knowing exactly where you're referencing.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're still on Chairman's announcements. In the past, we talked about having a members briefing for licensing, and I'm afraid it was postponed once or twice, but that is now going to happen on Thursday, the 5th of September. So that is an attempt to help members support their residents, and particularly in the license applications where it goes to a subcommittee. Okay, and then finally, in March last year, we received, or it might be the month after, a report from Environmental Health Licensing and Registration. And that was on all of the licensing that Oliver doesn't manage. So animal activities, approved food premises, campsites, cooling towers, mobile homes, polluting processes, tattooing, all sorts. So that hasn't come forward this year. So I've spoken to Jonathan Gill, and he will endeavour to have a report on that, including some year by year comparison, so we can understand the activities that environmental health do with licensing. So hopefully we'll get that at the next meeting, because it sounds quite interesting, I think, what's going on in our areas. Okay. So item 7, do we have any declarations of interest? So item 8, we've got our review of annual licensing activity in the financial year 2023 to 24 from Oliver, our Service Manager at Licensing and Enforcement.
Thank you, Chair. I'll start with an apology. There's no Q3 or Q4 report as there normally would be. Those were previously prepared by the licensing enforcement officers that are no longer in post. Due to the pressures of time and statutory stuff that I'm dealing with at the moment, I unfortunately didn't have time to do the 3 and 4, but I thought the annual would be something that we could look at. But in future, we'll be reinstating quarterly reports, so you'll see them at the end of each quarter, hopefully. I know you've had time to read the report and it's not particularly long, but I'll run through it bit by bit. And if you've got any questions, then I'll happily either take them during or at the end. So we started off by looking at enforcement and what we've been doing. So to be fair, we lost, when I say lost, a licensing enforcement officer left at the end of last year. So we were down half of the post then. We've still maintained a good number of visits and inspections. Q3 and Q4, every application that had a notice that was displayed was checked. So that identified a number of people that had either got something wrong on their notice or hadn't displayed it. And essentially what that does is that they have to put the notice up and restart the timing, but it gives us the opportunity to talk to the applicant and make sure that the public have the best opportunity to comment on these applications. So I was quite chuffed that when we looked at the figures, we'd been to every single one, because that doesn't always happen. And you'll see later on that we've had quite a few premises licenses applications as well. We were helped out to a certain extent with I manage the environmental crime officer as well, who very kindly, whilst out on district, would go and check some notices for us as well. So that picked up some of the slack for us. If we run down, the next part is performance indicators. We always do reasonably well. It's dropped slightly on a couple of them from last year, but that's due to volume of work. It's still within beating the targets, so I'm not too worried about it. We are 3 people down at the moment, so it's not a worry because we're still above the targets. If I move on to the hearings that we had, so we had quite a few hearings. What I haven't listed here is the ones that we prepared for, wrote reports for, were scheduled and then were withdrawn. So there was 2 or 3 of those as well. So that still has the same amount of work as a hearing that we have. That's happened recently as well. We've had 3 out of 4 have been withdrawn 2 days before the hearing. So we'll have done all the work, you'll all be ready to sit, all the money will have been spent, all the notices is done, and then they go, actually, I've changed my mind. So those aren't on here, but there was a couple of big ones on here. So there was Hertfordshire Oktoberfest, which was obviously at Hartham Common. Went off quite well, but there's a licensing subcommittee for their variation tomorrow. The one on there that jumps out at everyone, I imagine, is Ammerfest, which the actual event didn't go particularly well, particularly the traffic. It's a slight understatement. lots of lessons learned from that for the authority and for responsible authorities. Lots of stuff was taken away. So looking at the enforceability of conditions that people are offering, whether they've got the time to actually deliver what they're promising. Better dealings with highways. We didn't have the greatest relationship at the time, but we've had meetings since and we've worked out how we want to do things going forwards. So I would hope that the issues that arose after that license were granted wouldn't happen again because they would be cleared up at licensing subcommittee. So we'll make changes to the reports. So we'll point you in a direction to ask the questions that were missed on that, both by officers and I guess on the day. So sometimes it has to go wrong for things to get better. So we all did really learn a lot from that. A lot of meetings followed on from it. And obviously it was a one-off event, so it's never coming back here. If they apply, obviously what happened and how they approached it would all be taken into consideration. The final one on there is Ermin's Cafe, which was a small application for a new premises license. They were unhappy with some of the conditions that were attached to their license, so they subsequently appealed it to court within the appeal period. Discussions took place and legal agreed a consent order that slightly changed the conditions, having spoken to the councillors that were sat on that subcommittee. So the appeal went away, we didn't end up in court. If I move on to the essential reference paper B, or Appendix A, and I'll just run through some of the figures on there, some of the highs and lows, or the ups and downs really. So less new premises license applications I've written down. Yeah, less new premises license applications than last year. Still a good number of applications coming in though. Lots of DPS changes, so that's changes of designated premises supervisor and minor variations. Despite the fact the numbers are slightly lower than last year, quite a lot of those were big applications that had a lot of work involved in them. Clubs is always very quiet on applications. We tend to have the same figure we always have. We visit fairly regularly to make sure that they're maintaining their standards and maintaining their rules, because their rules and their constitution are part of what makes them a club. If they change that and start opening to the public, then they need to move over to a premises license. So we just keep an eye on how they're hiring venues and what they're doing. Personal license applications, that's gone down a bit, but that's just it's just one of those things you apply to where you move to. So if people don't want personal licenses, or they live in Broxbourne, so it's just an indicative thing. We didn't refuse any, and we haven't for a number of years. So if I come down to gambling next, so small society lotteries is about the same as last year. A couple of extra notifications of gaming machines. So if you're only having 2 of a certain category of machine and you're in an alcohol license premises, you just notify us and pay £50 telling us that you're going to have those 2 machines. More than 2 machines are higher categories. Some of those things would come to licensing subcommittee for decision, but that hasn't happened for a while. I'll leave the charity stuff there because that's just pretty consistent. Distribution of free literature, we don't get many applications for that, but it's on there for completeness. So I've noted down an increase in applications for private hire drivers. So it's leapt up to 54. So we've got a growing private hire trade. We hadn't had, well, last year we didn't have many applications, and that's higher than it's been for a number of years. There's an increase in the numbers of new Hackney carriage and private hire vehicles, so people changing their vehicles to a new vehicle. That's quite closely linked to the age and emissions policy that we brought in a few years ago, which is now its highest step. So it ticked over last year to be Euro 6 and younger vehicles. So lots of drivers have changed their vehicles this year because they haven't met the standards. So, or when I say this year, last financial year. So we haven't lost that many vehicles, but we've had quite a few changes. You'll see from the pavement license section, which is down onto the next page, we don't have many. So if we're saying we've got 12 new applications in total, there's more than 12 sets of tables and chairs out in Hertford, and then you go across the district, there's much more. So it's just like the tip of the iceberg. So some people are applying, but lots of people aren't aware of the regime, and lots of people have been doing it for years. So then we move on to the total number of licenses. So as I said, premises licenses are up overall. So they went down by 1 last year, but we're up to 653 premises licenses that licensed under the Licensing Act 2003. So that may not be alcohol, that may be takeaways, It could be a variety of things. So it might just be entertainment as well, but the numbers increased. Dual drivers is up after a slump last year. So that's drivers that drive Hackney carriages. We obviously have a limit on the number of Hackney carriage vehicles. We upped it last year to from 200 to 220 following an unmet demand survey. So at least quarterly, we open a round of applications for Hackney carriage vehicles. Then we have a scoring system. So a brand new electric vehicle or a brand new wheelchair accessible vehicle, if we're oversubscribed, gets licensed first, and then we work our way down a list of criteria. We offered 20 vehicle licenses at the last round. We had 20 applications, but unfortunately not all 20 applications came through. So we're going to open another round shortly so that we'll take more applications for Hackney carriage vehicles. Because we're sitting at 196 now, and we can have another 24. But we learned from the last round that not everyone who applies has actually really thought through the implications of saying you're going to buy a Euro 6 1-year-old fully wheelchair accessible vehicle, and then when it comes to it, so we give them plenty of time to do it and all the assistance we can, but not everyone took it up or managed to get a vehicle of the right standard. Yeah, so I think that's the last table in it. So yeah, when you look at the total number of pavement licenses that we have at the bottom of that table, we currently have 9 issued. So the ones that applied for, the 12 that were applied for, some of those are lapsed. So we're currently sitting at 9 in total. Thank you, Chair. That sort of summarises the report. If anyone's got any questions about any of the detail, I'll happily go back over it.
Thank you, Oliver. That's really useful background information as well. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
I have a question relating to Hammerfest. Did we have sufficient evidence to prosecute the applicant who didn't conform with the conditions? And if we did we decide not to, or why did we not decide not to?
The conditions weren't suitably written to be enforceable, so breaches could not be proved. So we ended up issuing advice because we weren't in a position to prosecute. So everything that happened could be taken into account if they came back.
Yeah.
But realistically, we wouldn't have won in court, so there was no point in prosecuting.
Okay, thank you. I've got another question, if I can just follow on. It's about the gambling machines. Did you say it's another 50 quid for a machine, or did I? No.
So there's various ways of doing it. So for alcohol licensed premises, if you're having 2 category C or below machines, you can send us a notification for £50, and they just have 2 machines.
Who sets the amount? The £50? Is that us, or is it?
That is government fee, statutory fee. So
Oh,
lots of the stuff we do is statutory fees. So
Yeah.
all of the Gambling Act stuff and all of the Licensing Act stuff. So
That's fine.
realistically, we never recoup our costs on those sort of things.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just to touch on the Ermine Cafe application and subsequent conditions and amendments that were made after that. My understanding is that it was a later period after the original decision that it was brought to fruition and that everyone was happy. I just wonder, is that because that's the statutory period in which someone's allowed to appeal? Could it not have been sorted out quicker than it was? That's my question.
Could you say the question again, please? I think
Yeah.
I missed the beginning of it, so I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, so you allude to the fact that the applicants complained about some of the conditions that were applied, and eventually that was sorted out. And as someone that was on that particular licensing subcommittee, I was involved in the meeting where it was decided that I forget which one it was now, but perhaps was a bit too onerous. But my understanding was that wasn't then corrected then and there. Is that because it took some time for that to wash through and actually be sorted out with the applicant? Is that because there's a legal requirement to take that amount of time? Why can it have been sorted out quicker than that? That's where I'm going with it.
So you mean after the decision was made and they appealed?
Yeah.
The time period that it took?
Yeah.
So there was discussion to and fro between our legal team and the applicant, because at least one of the conditions that they were appealing against was something that they offered and that was then imposed by the licensing subcommittee. So that puts a slightly different light on than if councillors had just put 4 conditions on out of the blue that were really unreasonable. So there was a lot of discussion about which of the conditions they would really want amended, how they'd want them amended, so that we could try and find, rather than just they come back and go, I want all 3 removed. I can't remember if it was 3 or 4, but all 3 removed. Then that may not be our position. So then we take legal advice. Legal come back and go, well, we'd obviously still like this on. What's the actual wording you're bothered about? So there's a lot of discussion that goes on, and there's a lot of time for that to happen because generally the appeal doesn't get to court for 6 months. So there's no timescale for it to be decided. Realistically, yes, it probably could have been done quicker. Lots of things always can, but I don't know what pressures legal had with other things. I don't know how fast the appellant was responding to contact. So sometimes these things drag. Sometimes we go, that's okay, it is unreasonable, it's fine, and it sorts itself out really quickly. So yeah, I couldn't say why it took so long.
Any other questions, comments? That's the one.
Yeah, just going back to prior to this, you talked about the applications that you're doing a lot of work on and then they get withdrawn a couple of days before. Are they charged for those applications or are we doing it?
So this is the weird thing about the Licensing Act 2003. So it's a statutory fee that hasn't changed since it came in 2005. So you apply for a festival in a field and you're only having 4,000 people. So the field hasn't got a non-domestic rateable value. So the fee for that application is £100. If you go above 4,999 people, there's a multiplier that attaches to it. So the more people you have, the more the fee is. But generally with some of these festivals, they're at 4,500 people and they're in a field. We get £100. We put in 28 days of consultation. We talk to all the residents. We write the reports. We schedule a subcommittee hearing. Democratic Services get involved. 3 of you find the time to come along. And then 2 days before, they can just pull out. So we never wipe our face on any of these applications, even if it went through without a problem. Just putting the application on the system and sending out the consultation would be more than £100 of my officer's time. So central government have been lobbied for quite a while to change the fees. But then you start hitting the smaller local businesses. So if you have a shop in town and the average non-domestic rateable value is like a band C, so you've got quite a small shop, that will cost you £180. But a festival is £100 in a field. So there's like a certain disparity there. But the fees haven't changed since 2005 and I don't see them changing anytime soon. So yeah, the stuff that gets withdrawn, it saves us a bit because we don't actually have to sit in the room at the end. But writing the report, sending it around for consultation, we do all the notices of hearing, we talk to all the residents, we talk to the applicant. Very time consuming. It's part of the reason why I haven't got a Q3 and Q4 is I've had 3 withdrawn in the last 6 weeks. So every one of those has had a 28-day consultation, then a hearing scheduled, then I've written a detailed report, which has gone to a head of service, gone to portfolio holder, everyone's read it and commented it, it's gone through legal, Democratic Services arrange a hearing, and then they walk away. So we never get that time back and we never make the money for it.
And just supplementary to that, do we have any serial offenders?
No, we don't. It's unusual for 3 to happen in a short space of time. It does. Last year we probably had 3 all year. This year we've had 3 already, and 3 big ones. So it's not a corner shop where it's a simple report where they want 1 AM for alcohol. It's something where you've got to spend some serious time on it because it's thousands of people.
Councillor Townsend.
Thank you. Just one other aspect on there. So if you apply, for example, and you'll understand why I'm asking this question, for 5 different TENS licenses, presumably they're treated on an event per, a charge per event. Is that right?
Yes, a temporary event notice is £21. So that would have cost £105 if you had 5 temporary event notices.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, thank you. So the recommendation for the licensing committee is that members review and comment on the licensing activity in the financial year 23 to 24. Could I have a proposer, please? So definitely, thank you. And a seconder? Councillor Smith, thank you. Please can we have a show of hands if you're in favour? Anybody against? Any abstentions? Okay, thank you. And finally, any urgent business, item 9. There's no urgent items, and so that concludes tonight's meeting at 19:35. Thank you very much.